All right.
Have fun.
Thank you. This was picking everything organized and like, it's actually really nice house. Without overcovering it. That's the worst part about moving. And there's always things that, like, there's a bathroom in the bathroom that goes with all the hardware that the line machine in your basement for 8 years. You come across, oh, hang on. House number and the property. And then go up to everything.
Yes, no more procrastination. We don't get those. Well, and that's, we moved several times. Just before we moved, paper and paint, and this is really stupid.
Yeah.
But nice to look at that.
I know. Yeah, our realtor is a friend of ours. She proposed a sale price that's way beyond what we would have.
I should do better.
Yeah, he wants to somehow, he put more or less down.
No, I can tell, here, let's not, let's be fair here. It's not working.
Well, and the end of their fine, but then let's count what I put in, which in the end, it's all on us. Like, because I put those hard to be hobby tests, so it was a stimulus package. If you have a test rate of $8,000, right, that, well, interest-free loan, pretty much, you know, so like, I got that. So, in the end, it should have just been like, I'll do money. Well, and then he started hearing about who had, it was like, did like 10 mortgages on my taxes. And then I actually got something. You really want to talk about this because I'm doing that. Oh, yeah, and I think you start to realize, like, maybe I should try to get home. So, yeah. And then, you know, cars, we both own cars, so I'll get my son. So we'll look at moving to I think in the end, it's gonna come down to just 50-50 because of the right. But it's transparency.
Only it would take long.
It would take a while.
Maybe taking a while.
You have to write a contract, put an agreement. All right, it's one pass and see. Well, I don't know if we're gonna reach our goal this way, but.
You know, just add it for miles.
No, it's still the 16 at Great Lines, we filter.
So I think,
Plus a few extra.
yeah.
Right.
This is really the comment. I started thinking, I need to email, I'm going to know your person. You know, like, anyhow. None of them are going to start until the end of May. It's like, oh, I need to know that. Yes, that's something we do, another call. Yes, somehow I track that. Yeah.
All right, it is just past the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. There's still some people getting lunch. As soon as they're done, we'll close this door. I don't know what they're doing back there, but it's making a lot of noise. I'm going to close the GoToMeeting menu at this point, or not close, minimize it, but we'll check at the end in the chat box. So if anybody that's listening in remotely, hi Lene, hi Nick, feel free to ask any questions in the chat box, and we'll check at the end when we look for questions. So today, a partner in crime is Penny Jester, and myself are going to talk about how to submit an IND, which is tedious but not rocket science. So we're always like, if you know how to submit a grant, submitting an IND is easier because you don't need to come up with the science. You just need to pull all the different parts together and put it in a certain format. It's just a lot of work. So the picture that you see here up front is called the Red Book. So there's actually, they wrote a book about this. There's a manual. I think it's called IND Submissions Primer. So we started an IND support office 2009 or so, 11, I don't know, maybe not that long.
A few years ago.
Yeah, a while ago. So we support investigators on campus that want to submit an IND. They don't have to use us, but we're here in free service. The CCTS is covering this service for anybody on campus who wants to use us. So we've definitely learned a lot over the last few years. And we're one-eyed in the land of the blind. We're working towards two-eyed double vision, but at least we typically know more than somebody who's never done it before. So we'll go today about what the purpose is of an IND, and there's different types, so we'll describe the different types. Also, when you need one, and maybe when you don't need one, how you actually apply for one, and how do you then manage an IND. And then we also help with IDEs, so those are investigational device exemptions. So INDs stands for investigational new drug applications. So for devices, the rules are pretty similar. There's actually a little less structure for IDEs. We also recently found out that IDEs have to be submitted electronically, whereas INDs we still use paper submissions. But other than that, they pretty much want to know the same stuff. Like, what's the safety, risk-benefit ratio, what do you plan to do with it, that kind of stuff. You want to jump in?
Sure. So, again, the purpose of, if you think about an IND, the FDA actually has a law. I've been on the books for many, many years that you're not allowed to transport drugs across state lines. So then they figured out but what they put in place was having licensure of a drug, which is where you start with the IND, get your drug license, so that you can actually, as much as we're doing it for safety of subjects, we want to know it's been approved, it's also to allow the drug to be shipped around. Kind of a little known fact about FDA and INDs and all. So the law is, you can't study drugs that aren't safe, and you can't ship drugs across state lines. Because if in fact you're doing a study just at UAB, you don't, let's
say we have made the drug here in Birmingham, Alabama, technically we would not need an IND.
Because we're not shipping it.
Yeah. Now, I don't think anybody here within the institution would feel comfortable with that, but that's the law.
But per the law, so the exemption is so that it can be shared, the drug can be shared and studied. And so again, most of the time, an IND is really for safety. It's really to make sure that and it's less about efficacy, really. With the FDA, they do look at some efficacy, but the big thing is they look at safety, and they want to make sure you're not administering a drug and or use of a device to a subject that may harm them. So what basically the protocol that is submitted, again, what they're looking for is it's not unnecessarily risky, so they're going to look at the preclinical data, the investigator's qualifications. That's clearly part of an IND. And if ever you've done a drug study for a pharmaceutical company, you have to provide them with the CV. You have to provide them with a medical license. That's so that the company can put that with their IND to show that the people who were studying the drug actually had the right qualifications. And also there's an evaluation of drug purity. So clearly the drug purity is something most of us in this room are probably not going to deal with, but someone else is going to have to prepare that for your IND package. So what happens with an IND is the sponsor must apply for permission to study the drug in humans, just as we said. So and it's all from, again, the FDA to have an IND. You have to have an IRB approval, and also there may be various other approvals at your institution to allow you to study a drug in humans. Clearly, we're talking about INDs and IDEs right now. Who can be the sponsor of an IND? It can be really one of many people. It can be an individual physician, an investigator sponsor is often what we call them. It can be an institution, or it can be in industry. And just so you know, here at UAB, we strongly recommend that there are a number of forms that are required for, again, an IND. One is called the 1571, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the institution, UAB, knows that if anybody at this institution, any investigator holds an IND, UAB is still going to be responsible, whether they have their name on it or not. They're going to be responsible, and they'll back you up if you have an IND. So in an effort to include the institution, we are encouraging, though it's not required, that we allow the Vice President of Research to be the key signatory on the the 1571, and he co-signs the cover letter. It's just like with OSP. You know, the institution signs off on your contracts, but you're responsible for that study. So that's kind of what this is sort of the same thing. You're still totally responsible if you hold an IND, but the institution may sign off.
And just to clarify the word sponsor a little bit, so sometimes sponsor, we think of the person who's sponsoring the money. That's actually a different, that's not what we're talking about here. The sponsor is really the person, or the entity holding the IND, being responsible for that the study is being carried out correctly, completely, ethically, and so on. The sponsor is not necessarily the entity that pays for the study. So you could have a study that's maybe paid for by NIH, and UAB is the sponsor. Now typically, if you are doing an industry-sponsored trial, that typically means that the industry, the company pays for the trial and also holds the IND. So in that case, they're sponsoring the two different ways of the word. But that sometimes gets a little confusing, especially people that also write NIH grants. They're like, sponsor, that's the person that pays the money, right? It should be, you know, this foundation that's paying for it. And I'm like, no. This is the person responsible, or the entity responsible for the study.
So there certainly are various types of INDs. We've got sponsor-initiated, investigator-initiated is another way of talking about it. We've had many investigators here at UAB who do get an NIH grant or a contract, and they hold the IND for that study, or they're just doing an investigator-initiated with funding from other sources. Again, it's pretty generic. There's emergency use, which is a type of research that is done under an IND where the drug itself is going to be used in an emergency situation. It's important to understand, and that's what goes into the application. It's clearly defined up front. Compassionate use is a bit different. Sometimes those two are confused. Mm-hmm. We did a study a number of years ago with using West Nile virus, using an immunoglobulin, which was high in West Nile virus titers, and it was just for a certain population, for specifically people over 40 years of age, because we were looking at people who had significant neuromuscular issues after being exposed to the disease. There was a child in New Jersey who was had a transplant, was transplanted with organs which were infected with West Nile virus. So what we did was that site did a specific compassionate use protocol so they could use our drug, because if you think about it, when we got the IND to use the drug in our study population, it was for that study population. This child was out of that population, but there was nothing else to give them. So what happens in that scenario, if you end up doing a compassionate use, it's a very minimized application, but you still have to submit to the FDA to get an IND, to get permission to use that drug in a compassionate use form. There's also expanded access, which is also, we've done those as well. We have a couple of expanded access protocols here at UAB. You still get, what you're still doing is getting IND, you're getting FDA approval to study the drug, but it's really not considered a study that is going to allow for licensure of the drug. But it's going to give you permission from the FDA to let the public know that it's a safe drug, but we're not really going to use this for research.
Yeah, it's not approved yet. So.
And yes, that's the key.
Question. Mm-hmm. It's solving for me, so I'm trying to understand. So like the compassionate use, the example that you just gave, for this kid who is not here, but say that study, we can do that study here at UAB, but just for over 40. Mm-hmm. And if a kid here at UAB wants to do it, mm-hmm. then in that scenario,
it would be compassionate use.
It would still be compassionate.
But you can form IRB besides the IND.
Yes, you have to get IRB approval. You get a consent form. But what we ended up doing was, again, know that our West Nile virus study was multi-center, so we were in many cities, many academic centers around the country. But yes, we often share. If you have an IND and somebody wants to use it compassionately and the FDA is going to approve it, we often share the consent form and even the case report forms, just so they can collect data. Now, that data cannot be used in our study, but it may be important information just to be descriptive for descriptive uses later. So that's what we've often done. Give them the consent form, then they tweak it, get their local IRB approval, and get it to the FDA, because that would have to happen as well. The relatively new type of IND, we haven't seen any of these, would be the phase 0. And
Yeah, that's when you use really low doses of a new drug, and it's typically done to look at pharmacokinetics, especially when you use maybe a radio-labeled tracer. So there's this defined amount of drug that you can give to fall under this phase 0 at something 247 nanograms or some odd number like that. If you stay under that, it will be considered phase 0. And so if you have really sensitive detection techniques with, LCMS or whatever, or with radioactive tracers, you can still follow what happens with that drug in a human body. That may be very valuable information. It's the same as what you got in your preclinical testing in, let's say, your monkeys or your dogs or something like that. So you can extrapolate. Is this safe to then go escalate to phase 1? But you kind of have a sense of what's going to happen when you administer this particular compound to a human. When do you need an IND? So on the left side is pretty obvious. If you're using an unapproved product, something that's not legally obtainable otherwise, so it's required for a new drug or biological product to be used in a clinical trial. Now on the right side, there's a column that says for an approved product. So when do you need to have an IND to test an approved drug that physicians can already prescribe? So it's required if you want to study a new aspect of an already approved drug. So for example, a different indication. Let's say this asthma drug you want to now study for its effect on osteoporosis, and you may want to actually gather that data to then ultimately warrant that drug getting approved by FDA for osteoporosis. You need to do an IND at that point in time. Different route of administration or dose also requires an IND. New drug combination, when you combine one with another. In antivirals, you see that a lot, like the HIV drugs. It used to be, you took like buckets full of pills. Now you can take one pill a day. Well, all of those are actually drugs combined into one form. You need to have a new IND for that if you want to study it for the first time. And then different population. So if, that West Nile virus study, for example, if you now want to study in a controlled fashion how those immunoglobulins would affect pediatric population, you would actually write an IND for that. So this is different than off-label use. So any physician, using their judgment, can prescribe an approved drug for something else to a particular patient. That has and always will be legal. But
actually doing the science to figure out whether that works or not.
That's right.
Correct.
There's no evidence.
Yes, you hit the nail on the head. So
it's a very clear example of this is we were, I can't remember when the swine flu came out, but the year prior to that, we had decided, I work in pediatrics in part, and Tamiflu never had been given. Black box warning on the package insert, do not give to children under 1 year of age, because when they gave it 500 times the dose to baby rats, they had seizures. Now, mind you, nobody's ever going to go 500 times the dose, but that's what the black box warning said. In order to get to the IND, because Roche didn't want us to do it, we knew doctors were doing it off-label. So we did a retrospective chart review of multiple institutions, looked at all the records of children who received Tamiflu under 1 year of age, and looked at their 2 to 3 year outcomes to see if there were any seizures. Yeah, and there were not. So that gives us evidence to prove, it was quite an interesting process because it made perfect sense. It is being done off-label. No, we don't have research, so we need the research to show that it's a good thing. So, yeah, very good.
And changed the label.
And we ended up changing the package insert. Yeah.
So sometimes you do not need an IND. And so we always, that is one of the questions we deal with a lot when people contact us, do I need an IND or not? Well, these are the criteria that we'll go through bullet by bullet point with the particular PI to see if you meet all these criteria, then you're exempt. So you have no intention at all to support changing the label. You're not going to advertise on Birmingham Mountain Radio, everybody take, blah, 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 and it will cure your foot fungus. You're not, no factors such as route of administration, dosage, or study population significantly increases risk. Now, let's say you propose to go from adult population to pediatric population, you would probably not meet that particular criteria because it's a completely different population that would probably increase risk, so you would not be exempt. But if it's the same kind of, let's say, adults, 40 years and older, and you're not changing any of that, not a problem. You still need informed consent and IRB review requirements. and then you're not going to promote or represent this product as safe for this particular disease. If you hit all those, you do not need an IND. So what we also recommend, because many times we actually start having a discussion with the IRB, because the IRB may ask you, like, I think you need an IND, and then we discuss together with the PI and the IRB, are these bullet points checkable, yes or no? And if so, then we do not need an IND.
A number of years ago, I was in a meeting with the FDA and asked them, how do we know? I mean, again, these are great guidelines, but then, there's always that gray area. And they said, ask your IRB. So certainly we can have the discussion and we can help you come up, if you want some assistance, and help you come up with justification for all of these if guide you. And then that gets submitted to the IRB, actually, is what happens. And then the IRB makes a determination. One of the types of studies that I think we've seen recently, and Micah, help me if this isn't quite right, that did not require an IND was when they were giving a drug or a biologic to a human just to see what the metabolic reaction was.
Oh, yeah.
And that had nothing to do with any of these.
No therapeutic intent.
It's just to look for processes. So it'd be like, and again, in some ways, studying it in an animal. You're just looking to see what the reactions are with no intent of labeling.
Yeah, so we have a few quizzes. Yay, participatory seminars. So we had a protocol where a PI wanted to study the therapeutic effect of a food supplement that you can buy at like GNC. It's available over the counter on the prevalence of type 1 diabetes. So the question to you is, do we need IND or not? If you think yes, raise your hand. Right? If you think no, okay, we have about 50-50. Oh, I'm getting another no, so yes, therapeutic intent. So you can try to, grab a handful of dirt out of front of pecans and want to cure asthma, you need an IND. So even though you can just get it out.
And I do think this has been probably a change in the FDA's view of their, again, food additives and food supplements, because they're becoming such a big thing. I think maybe 10 or 15 years ago you wouldn't have needed, nobody would have cared, but today they care. It matters.
So then we have another one. This was one that we struggle with a lot. So study whether the use of Prozac enhances the effects of physical rehabilitation or motor function in stroke patients. Who thinks yes, an IND? Okay, we have like 4. Who thinks no? 1, 2, 3, and a lot of I don't know, 4, 5.
The answer,
the answer is no. So we actually went to the FDA with this, and they came back to us like, we don't need this stuff, you go ahead. So, well, it was a surprise for us, and but better safe than sorry. So, and yeah. So yeah, if you're not sure, there's a guidance. There are so many guidances on the FDA website, it's actually kind of a pain because there's thousands and thousands of them, but there's a pretty decent search box. There's a guidance. Then as Penny said, ask the IRB. The IRB thinks you need an IND, you need to submit. Then the FDA may overrule that and say, in the case of the example, for example, but you start with the IRB, and then ultimately you can also just ask the FDA.
Do they provide a written documentation when you ask for that?
the IRB?
The FDA, yes.
Yeah.
And how did that come? Just like a standard memo?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And
And that's after we submitted it. And now granted, if you call and ask some questions, you're not going to get anything in writing most likely,
Yeah.
and they're going to read the regulations to you, which doesn't help. But then again, that's the way it works.
Okay, so you actually submitted in the PI.
We submitted it, we thought we needed one, so we,
Yeah.
So if you want, you can apply for exemption. You pretty much have to submit the same information that was for the full IND. So I think we had one case where we kind of like, oh, we don't know, it was different in this particular one. We're like, let's just pretend it's an IND because we need, you need still need a CV, what's the clinical protocol, what's known about the drug, because the FDA will want to look at it before they grant you an exemption. So at that point, let's just use our template. It's easier just to follow our template in our format to submit an IND, and then we'll see what comes back. So, yeah. Whenever somebody hears they have to apply for an IND, they start panicking.
And so we have an office, there are 3 of us. It's Micah, who is actually the scientist, and then I come with a clinical background, and Dunya Ritchie works with us, and she's sort of our editor and keeps us all on track with all the forms. And meeting the application requirements of the FDA. So,
And Juliet made a wonderful database, she's in the audience,
That's
to
right.
keep us on track,
To
like,
keep
do we
us-
have all the different parts, and how does it all together? So how do you apply for an IND? Like it says over there, forms. And that's a little bit different than the IDE. We were kind of surprised when we did our first IDE or the device one. We're like, where are the forms? And they're like, yeah, just submit what you think we would need. Oh my God, no structure. So we made our own template and it seems to be working okay. But there are a couple of ones that are the most important ones, the 1571, 1572, 3674, and 34. 54, you will remember those numbers the more and more you use them.
and I'll probably get these two mixed up, but this one is this is sort of like I call the 1571 the communication sheet that goes with every submission you have, because all it is you just say on there, you put your demographics, so of your protocol or your IND, and you say, I'm submitting a new protocol, I'm submitting an amendment, I have some other material to submit, and then it just gets signed off by everybody. The 1572, if any of you have done drug studies, you're very familiar with this. Now, mind you, none of these are required for an IDE, but the 1572, again, that's an essential part of the IND package.
Yeah, so that's the information about the investigator. You sign off like, I'm hereby, like I'm a trustworthy person, I can do this.
Yeah, and I'm gonna follow the
Follow the
GCPs
rules.
and follow the rules.
Yeah.
Okay, 364. Now, one of these has to do with conflict of interest.
Yeah.
And I know always.
I always forget,
So one is about conflict of interest, and one is also saying, and you say that all the people on the study, and we have the Vice President for Research sign off on this so that the investigator doesn't have to be compromised. For the financial disclosure, the institution signs off and says, yeah, all the people who are listed in this protocol do not have conflicts with this.
Or if they do, it's managed.
Yeah, that's right.
We have one protocol with Jim Markert, for example, who's studying simplex virus for glioblastoma. The protocol is currently active. Well, that viral vector is invented and developed here at UAB. So it was actually institutional conflict. So what ended up happening is that, plus, so Jim himself, as an inventor on the patent, could not be associated with the trial. So he's not a PI on the trial. There's different people in the neurology department that are actually running the study. He was helping with the paperwork, but he's not touching any patients because of the conflict situation. In addition, we needed to use the IRB or Vanderbilt because they didn't want the UAB IRB to review a study that had a potential financial gain for UAB. So, and then the other one is registering on clinicaltrials.gov.
Yes, to say whether you are or whether you're not. It's a very simple form.
Yeah.
The protocol should have been finalized before you submit it, because what you do when you're submitting a protocol, you want the FDA to review it. I mean, they're going to look at your protocol. We have a format, but it really can be in a number of formats as long as all the area sections are identified. One of the things, we'll talk about this in a minute, is that there is a format. The Red Book gave us the format, and it helps the FDA if we submit it in a format that's familiar to them, because then they know which section to go to review, because you send it in and they divide it up among different people to review it. So that's one of the reasons for the distinct sections. Mm-hmm. And also, you don't have to have IRB approval when you submit. You can say it's pending, but they do want to see a sample consent form if you don't have the final consent form. And as you know, our IRB will not approve a protocol unless you have an IND. So they'll review it to the point of, okay, this is good to go, but we need your IND number. So
what we do many times is we stick that approval form from the IRB saying pending IND approval, you're good to go. We put that in the IND so that they can see that our IRB has looked at it. And then so sometimes we do it in parallel, that we submit to IRB and at the same time. Sometimes we already have IRB approval pending IND application, and then it goes that way. So yeah, we use paper submissions for IND applications. So it's a lot of trees that go through this. So there's fancy binders that you need to get. There's even specification like this is the order number and this is where you need to get it. I mean, you need to have 3 blue ones and 1 red one and 1 green copy. So our office has all of that. So you don't need to go to this. Only one website sells this stuff. They're probably making a killing. So what you do is you submit it in triplicate. Mm-hmm. Then you keep also copies here locally on file. So you can imagine. So if you have the picture on the right, I put my Blazer ID there just for reference how much it is. That's 1 copy of IND for a new product. So you submit 3 of those to the FDA, and then you have 1 on your shelf, and then typically we give one to the FPI shelf as well. If it's an approved product, you don't need as much because there's a section that deals with manufacturing of the drug and safety studies and so on. If it's an approved drug, you can just stick in the label. You download a PDF from the internet and you stick it in. That's your manufacturing information because it's already approved. Plus, we get approval from the manufacturer that says you can cross-reference everything that's on file from us when you want to look at the information in this particular IND. So you just have one letter. If you have a new product and you have manufacturing information, that was actually for the herpes simplex virus study for glioblastoma. So there's binders and binders of how was it made, did they follow all the GMP manufacturing rules, where all the, you know, when you get like a bottle of PBS and it comes with an insert what the lot number is, for everything that touched that product, that information sheet is in that particular packet. So you can imagine that it gets, you know, it expands pretty quickly. So there is a way to submit electronically. Now you would think that would be easier, right? Well, nothing is further from the truth. So there's actually a specific portal that you need to use to communicate with the FDA so that it's all secure and it adheres to all kinds of regulations, and we looked into it. It costs tens and tens of thousands of dollars to get the software that's able to communicate that way in a secure fashion with the FDA. A lot of the steep learning curve and how to use it. So we recently found a PDF of a PowerPoint of I think it was a consulting group that talked to a lot of academic medical centers where they say either outsource it if you do want to go electronic, or if you have the volume to do it internally, then hire a specific group to kind of do this, but it's going to cost you a lot of money. So ultimately the FDA is switching to only allowing electronic submissions, but thus far it only applies to commercial drug companies. Academic institutions are exempt. So we're like, unless we have to, we're going to stick with paper, just because going electronic involves more than burning this stuff on a DVD and sending it to Maryland.
So what we have found with the IDEs is, as Micah mentioned earlier, they do want it electronically, but what it electronic for that is, right, at least for us right now, is copying it on CD. Right now, for IDEs, we have to, INDs, we have to do paper, but for, I think, device studies, we're going to be able to burn it to a disk. It's still, that's as electronic as it gets.
Yeah, and there's some filing naming convention that, you know, this kind of file that says this clinical protocol needs to be, like, starts with these and these numbers. Well, that's pretty easy to do. You don't need specific software for that. So yeah, there's suggestion once you start thinking about submitting for an IND to actually have a pre-IND meeting. So it's a formal way to communicate with the FDA that you have these plans to ultimately submit an IND, and you can request their input on how to design toxicity studies, the clinical protocol, and so on. Now you do need to phrase those questions in kind of that they can answer yes, no to. If you go to them like, how should I design a toxicology study? They're like, we're not in that business. You need to have a plan, like this is kind of what we plan to do. Is that acceptable to the agency? And then they say yes or no, and they may give you some input. So you have to have a plan first that they can critique. They're not going to help consult with you how to actually do it, but it's still very helpful. However, it's not required. So for example, for the IDE, we recently did this for a brain device. We're using it with neurology. One of those DBS implants, you know, that buzzes your brain and helps with Parkinson's. I'm butchering it right now. It's a fancy type of probe. We kind of talk back and forth with the PI, should we have a pre-IDE meeting or not? Because on one hand, it's nice to have the FDA's input on what you ultimately want to do. On the other hand, we decided in that particular case, there was already a lot of information about the device out there. It's already on the market in Europe. The company was going to help us with, you know, this is how we manufacture it, and these are the plastic parts that go into it, and so on. So ultimately we decided, let's not do a pre-IDE meeting because it's just as much work to just put the IDE together, send it in, and then see what comes back. And thus far, we haven't heard from them. It's been 2 weeks. So they have 30 days. We'll see.
If you do a pre-IND, as Micah said, you have to, there's a whole laundry list of things you have to submit, which is almost as much as your final protocol, as final submission.
Yeah.
So for that reason, if you're relatively confident and have the time to just go ahead and submit it, I think you're better off.
Yeah.
I've done a couple of studies where we had pre-IND meetings, and It was really just to make sure that the FDA was okay with our safety. And the first one I did was like 10 years ago, and we had to go to the FDA to do it. And in more recent years, we've had pre-INDs, they're all conference calls. So it's a lot easier, but you still have to submit all the material. So one could also argue that by the time you do your pre-IND, if you really want to have one, and again, especially looking at safety, asking questions of the FDA about safety, you're ready for your submission.
And you have a good story about when you work with a company, they didn't want to file the IND, they wanted to have another pre-IND meeting. Because for a commercial company,
Yep.
they didn't want to submit the IND and then be put on clinical hold for something trivial because it may affect their stock price.
That's right. We were working with a very small, new pharmaceutical company, Chimerix. I think they've gone out of business because their practices were a little suspect, but nonetheless, we had one pre-IND, and then they did want to have another one, as Mike has said, because because apparently when you have an pre-IND meeting, all of that information is open to the public, and so I guess that could have affected their stock price.
Yeah, they wanted to make sure they had all the ducks in a row.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Penny said, currently, well, if you have a formal pre-IND meeting, you still need to do a lot of paperwork, but we also informally talk to the FDA all the time, like, hey, how do you think we should, mostly about procedural issues, usually. So Penny calls them up all the time, we send them emails. But those, they will not give you any binding advice in their email communication with you. They are the federal government. So the benefit is what was said, like we talked about, if you clear some stuff with the FDA first, it may help the IND finally sail through a little bit more quickly. They're also familiar with your protocol, and especially when it's an absolutely new drug that has never touched a human, having their input and how you design your toxicology studies and so on will be really helpful. Like, hey, we plan to do this species and that one. These are our reasons. Is that okay with you? Instead of them, you're doing, let's say, a tox study in guinea pigs, and then they come back like, oh, we want to see non-human primate studies. Well, that's another, half a year and $500,000 worth of work. It will be good to know that before you put everything together.
So let me just clarify, because I think I misspoke a little bit by using pre-IND too much. The pre-INDs never are made public. So you could have 20 pre-INDs and nobody ever knows. It's that when you submit your IND, that becomes public, and that's what the company didn't want to do. They would rather have had 20 pre-INDs to make sure it was crystal clear what we were doing and that it would get approved.
So the application itself is divided into certain sections, and every section has a particular purpose, and that's what Penny was referring to when she said, the FDA is used to looking at, for example, Section 5 that has the investigative brochure or product insert, or previous human experience is always in Section 9. So what happens is that a lot of these sections go to a particular reviewer who is used to dealing with, for example, manufacturing information. So there's a lot of repetition. And if you were writing an NIH grant or like an R01, you want to avoid repetition because then reviewers get kind of pissy. Like, man, you're just copying and pasting. Every IND is not the same thing. You can copy and paste to your heart's content as long as the information is correct and applicable to that section. So Section 1 is really just a 1571 form. As Penny said, it really communicates, this is what I'm submitting. These are the parts that are in this particular package. There's even a special section for the table of contents. And as you can imagine, if you have a big stack like this, you need to actually volumize your table of contents. So that's why we always say, like, it's not rocket science, but it's super tedious, because you can imagine just dealing with PDFs and that the page numbers are all correct, and then making the table of contents, and then you mess up in one section and you add one page and everything else changes. It's just, luckily Dunya helps with that. Section 3, introductory statement, is really just an overview, big picture, just one page. This is kind of what we're doing. This is how many subjects will be enrolled. This is how long it will take. Section 4, general investigational plan. So that's also a little bit like, this is why we're doing it, a little bit more expanded. Section 5, like we said, investigative brochure or product insert. So product insert is that label. So if you use an approved drug, that's just where you stick the label. If you only have one site, you do not need an investigative brochure. As soon as you expand to multiple sites, you need to create the equivalent of the label called the investigative brochure for an unapproved product, where you put in all this information. Is typically on the label. You get nausea, So, for example, we worked with Greg Friedman here in pediatrics in neurology, who had a protocol to use that same virus in pediatric glioma patients. He wants to expand to a different site. So now he needs to write an investigative brochure. So we actually pulled in an outside science writer to help with that, just because it's a lot of work. Section 6 is the protocol itself. So typically people have that. We may want to reformat it a little bit so that we're sure that everything is in there that the FDA asked for, but I'm sure everybody uses their own templates and every base is covered. The Section 7, CMC, stands for Chemistry, Manufacturing, and Controls. And that's usually a really thick section that's about how did I make the product. This was the lot number for PBS, and I ordered it from Sigma on July 2nd, 2012. Just so that if something goes wrong, we can look back, like what exactly did we do to manufacture this product? And then let's say there's a fungal infection that happens in every patient that gets injected with this virus. Well, we want to backtrack and see where that came from. Section 8, Pharmacology, Toxicology. Pharmacology is kind of if you have animal studies that show that your drug works in an animal system, that's nice to show, but the meat is in the toxicology part. Also, that has to be done under GLP before it goes to the FDA. So it's typically very expensive for new drugs to have that done because there's, again, lots of paperwork involved. Again, tracking this mouse came from this breeder on this and this day, and it's this strain, and it had this lot number of this product administered by this technician at 12:05, and it's also initialed by the other technician and the supervisor, and the quality assurance looked at that to make sure that they follow the protocol. I mean, that's all that information is in that section, so it can also be expanded quite rapidly. Section 9, previous human experience. It just, like with the device that we're helping with now that's already on the market in Europe, well, we could refer to some of that information, helps the FDA kind of feel confident. Section 10, additional information. That's when you deal with pediatric populations or radioactive drugs. There's a few, you need to fill that out if you deal with those particular circumstances. Section 11 is really not applicable to us. And then Section 12, that's where your clinicaltrials.gov document goes. So as you can imagine, this is a lot of stuff. So we created a template. And it contains some stock language, for example, about UAB, especially for you, but hospital, we know how many beds there are and what facilities we have. Links to forms, instructions to forms, and instructions on what information goes where.
We provide it in a Word template so that you can just build on it and delete what you don't need. So basically, again, with the submission, after you have submitted, there's supposed to be an acknowledgement letter that it was received. That doesn't always happen, but you will get acknowledgement that it was received. Yeah. And the other thing that occurs is you can also ask. If we've had studies where the FDA does not have, and so let me step back. When you submit for an IND, the FDA has 30 days to refuse. It doesn't mean that they have 30 days to send you an approval. They don't. They just have 30 days. Within that 30-day period, you can't do anything. After that 30 days, if you haven't heard from them, you can start the study, which is very scary to me because what if it didn't get to the right people? So again, they will say that's how the law is written. Now what we have done is you get to that 30-day point and you email somebody at the FDA and said, did this go through okay? Because it's scary to think of not getting an affirmative to move forward. So again, and then you will get an IND number, and many times you get a letter, but we have had times when we just haven't heard anything from them and have to prompt the FDA to give us information.
But the RP is not going to let you proceed without that, right?
They're not going to let you proceed without the IND number. That's the key. It's not. They don't look for the. I've not given them the letter. Now, sometimes people ask for the letter, but again,
my ask for the may proceed letter.
I think they have asked for it, but I've often not. I mean, again, it's not required that they do that. They might, and then you want that may proceed letter. But again, we had a study that went 45 days and we didn't hear from the FDA, and we went ahead and started it, and then we got the letter. So, and then we had hold. I think there were some hold items in there, but nobody was involved, so we were okay. The biggest thing is the actions. The biggest thing that they will do is put you on hold. And that means we need you to address, what that means is we have gone through this IND application and there are things we need you to address or to change or to answer before you can move forward. That is the biggest thing. That's the biggest thing you worry about. You also can, again, they might conclude that it's an exempt study like they did with the one we submitted. And again, they call this, we call it passive activation. Again, that's just what I sort of described about, it's 30 days and then you can start.
And so in addition to clinical holds, there may also be non-hold items. So they may ask for some more information, but you're allowed to go ahead. Well, we have a few, like, describe exactly how the PCR test works to evaluate this particular biomarker, for example. There's not a hold issue. You can go ahead and start collecting data, but they still want to have an answer to that. So, you want to keep that to your friends, so you're going to do your best to answer it.
And we have got those non-hold items. You can sometimes take several months to respond. It's not, there's no big, you certainly want to address them at some point. You don't want to ignore the FDA with their comments, but you do want to, there's not a time limit on when those need to be submitted. We in fact had an investigator who probably, she didn't really do it until she got to her annual review. And then she submitted, a revised protocol and some revised statements. But again, the FDA said it was okay to go forward with what she had. They just wanted to understand a few things. The biggest reason for holds are the safety issues, risks, that the FDA will say this is concerning to us. Incomplete information about risk is sort of the same thing. Your protocol is not complete, misleading, erroneous, or material incomplete investigator brochure. We haven't seen many of these. I think there was the one study we had some risk issues. And the one was that we did have one with the design on that food additive study. They were concerned about the design. And the thing you have to remember about the FDA is, as investigators, you sometimes know more than they do. So this was a study that was treating, it was a food additive, and they were treating children who were newly diagnosed type 1 diabetics. And the issue was, the FDA said, well, if you're giving this to children, you need just to always start with adults. Well, someone who's newly diagnosed with type 1 diabetes is almost always going to be a child. Adults, do they get type 1? Yes, they do, but it takes a year and a half to get them diagnosed, because they always, in general, because it's often thought that it takes longer to get, nobody thinks about type 1 diabetes in adults. It gets masked, it gets confusing, and so even the endocrinologists here at UAB say it's going to be a year before someone truly diagnosed with a type 1 diabetes. And this drug, and the intent of the food additive was it had to be given early. So the only population that it could really be done in was children. But the FDA didn't understand that. So after we educated them, they were fine. So know that even the hold items don't mean, and know that the FDA still can be wrong. And they will listen.
Yeah, we had also with Michelle's project with azithromycin for RSV. I think the FDA had a question about dosing, and they were not sure what the pharmacokinetics of this particular drug was studied well in a pediatric population for her to proceed. And then we actually found a lot of papers, and we just submitted like a little mini research write-up, like, see, this is the information that we based our dosing regimen on. And they're like, oh, okay, thanks, you're good.
So that's, sometimes they just need the justification.
So after the IND has active and enrolling patients, what do you need to do with subjects? You need to submit an annual IND report, and there is actually a time window there. I think it's 60 days plus or minus your anniversary date. So how's it going? You submit lots of tables with this is how many subjects we enrolled, this is how many dropped out, etc. Safety issues, of course, that did not qualify as an SAE that needed to be reported immediately. Because if you have an SAE or an AE, adverse event, you have to report to the FDA within 15 days of discovery. So it needs to be serious, related, and unexpected. It needs to hit all those three things. It can be super serious and related, but if you expected it in your design, it does not qualify for this rule, and you don't need to report it immediately, just in your annual report.
And again, also, if you tell in the protocol, if you tell the FDA you're going to report certain SAEs in a timely manner to them, then you have to adhere to that. So there's always a regulation, and then there's what you said in your protocol that you were going to do. So keep that in mind. So there are certainly two kinds of monitoring. There's subject monitoring, where you have an independent monitor come in and just review that. If you're holding an IND, it's a wise thing to have somebody outside of your group monitor your activity and monitor the data you're collecting. It gives you more validity, your study more validity, if you have an independent monitor. And then there's also the Data and Safety Monitoring Board I think on the 1571, there's a place that kind of describes, are you going to have a data and safety monitoring board? Are you going to have an independent safety monitor? And again, this is an independent group of scientists who look at if you're not familiar with that, who look at the study and the safety, and sometimes the efficacy, depends on the study, to make sure that it's good, it's okay to keep going. They're kind of like the eyes and ears for the FDA.
That's it.
That's all we had.
Yes. So yeah, like we said, it's tedious but not hard. Just takes all the time. And we probably know more than you, but we don't know everything. And that's when Penny calls up the FDA like, how does this work? And then, you know, we've done probably about 10 now or so, maybe even a little more.
Probably more than that.
Yeah.
In the summer we started, and then back out.
Yeah.
They got
So
scared.
in every disease area that you have, we can help. And we can share, of course, a template. Also, you know, check with other PIs if they're okay, if we can share their full application, just to make your job as easy as possible. But any questions?
Just curious, how long does it take from beginning to end to complete one, going at just a normal kind of rate, not, you know, expediting it?
Well, the normal rate is probably 6 months.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if you really sat down and really wanted to get done, if you were doing one with an already licensed product and you can get and you know what your protocol is, you probably could do it in a week. I mean, if you really pushed hard. Now, if
We
you
didn't have any other meetings.
Right.
Yeah.
24/7.
Yeah,
there you go.
Come on. 8 hours a day.
And just because of the, you know, we review things and make sure that everything is clean and ready to go. Sometimes, again, because of all the other things we do, it takes maybe a couple weeks. We like to have that much time. We can rush and get things done, but we'll, you know.
Yeah, many times getting signatures is actually a bit of a hassle. We did finally get word from the FDA that having, I was almost going to say Dick Marquez, Chris Brown, who's our new Vice President for Research, he can sign a document and then they could just PDF it back to us and email it instead of having a runner actually getting wet signatures.
You don't need wet signatures.
Yeah, so that really expedited a lot of things. But still, we want to have everything spick and span in perfect order before we start collecting signatures, so that then usually adds a few days, especially if there's holidays or things like that. So it's neat, mundane things like that that actually don't end up taking a lot of time. Or printing. We have one application where I found out later there's pages and pages of gobbledygook in one of the sections because the printer malfunctioned. So, you know.
You always have to allow for those things.
Exactly. And then you don't want to have promised the PI goes up tomorrow and then running those kind of issues. So we just like to have the schedule for that reason because life happens. Yeah. But it's fun and doable, and just try to encourage people to, you know, at least not have that be an obstacle to doing innovative clinical studies.
So is there a fee associated with the application?
No.
Not for like clinical trial, there's a fee, right?
Just to conduct the study, but to do the IND, no. And, you know, just like CCTS covers, you know, whatever time we spend.
We're free.
So we're free. We're cheap.
We're free to you.
We're free.
We're not free to the institution.
But, an investigator can certainly do it his or herself if they want, and we'll still provide the tools and provide consulting, but we're also...
I mean, FDA doesn't charge a fee
No.
for reviewing this.
No. There is a fee when you also at least submit for market approval, but that's way down the line, and we would never, in an academic institution,
Never gotten there.
You would not do a phase 3 registration study. It's just too expensive. You may do one for an industry sponsor, but then you would have to deal with all that. Yeah, so typically the trials that we help with have, I'd say, anywhere between 10 and 100 subjects or something. We haven't done one where there's, you know, 15 sites and 30,000 patients for a cardiac study, but we don't do that. So, all right. Well, thanks for coming. Next week, if anybody's interested, we have a talk about business development. So if you're ever interested in like what does it take to sell the cool products that we make here at UAB, or, you know, to Eli Lilly. We have Mark Rivera come and he explains kind of how that process works, and from what I'm learning, it's kind of like with dating. Like you have to try a lot and it takes a long time, and then ultimately you have to build trust, I just see each other a lot. Or exit left, yeah. All right, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. So, and stop recording. Just click on this somewhere.